Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is,
My name is Sarah Newman, and I'm an assistant professor of archaeology and anthropology at the University of Chicago.
well, it's fantastic to make your acquaintance. You have a great map behind you, great looking map. It's
Yeah.
got great colors of green, but I can't work out what it's a map of.
It's a map of Narragansett Bay in Rhode Island.
Are you from Rhode Island?
No, but I went to Brown for my graduate school, so I spent a lot of time there. And my husband teaches at Brown
Oh,
now, so I
right.
sort of half time live in Rhode Island.
You're often there. I've
Yeah.
never been to Brown, but I did give a talk at RISD, which is,
Oh.
3 feet away, probably.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And what does your
Yeah,
husband
they're
teach?
closely
Can I
connected.
ask?
Yeah.
What does your husband teach? Can I ask?
He's also an archaeologist. He's a classical archaeologist.
So I won't ask whether you met on a dig. That would be too cliche of me.
Yeah, no, but actually, since we work in kind of very different parts of the world,
Yeah,
it actually makes for, very good summers of travel. We spend some time in Mexico and Guatemala, and then some time in Turkey. So,
lovely. So, Prof, I wanted to ask my usual opening gambit uh, that I pose to people, which is to inquire what's currently dynamizing, impeding, preoccupying, interesting you. What's going on for the prof?
I mean, I think, this is probably kind of a vague or maybe big answer, but
That's
I
fine.
think that in a lot of ways at the moment, I'm spending a lot of time kind of trying to imagine what the future is going to be like, kind of in both the short and the long term, I think. Um, in some ways, that has to do with just like on the year to year basis, it's kind of hard right now, uh, living in the United States to have a sense of what might happen tomorrow, what might happen next week, what might happen in 6 months to 1 year. But then, I think like a lot of people, I'm also kind of, and some of this has to do with the news that changes over the day or the week or whatever. But I am thinking also a lot about kind of, yeah, what things are going to look like in 10, 20, 30 years as well. So, yeah, I would say I'm kind of preoccupied at the moment with thinking
Yeah.
about the future.
Yes, and that's an interesting thing for an archaeologist to be preoccupied with because you folks are really crucial to understanding the past and the present in terms of really big things and really little things too. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Yeah, for sure.
And but you often look for clues to the here and now in a past that has been hidden.
Yeah, actually, I would say I think the thing that I find kind of exciting about archaeology, there's lots of aspects to it. Of course, I like being in interesting places and meeting different people and working outside, all sorts of kind of, practical things. But I think one of the things that I find really exciting about archaeology and anthropology more generally is just the fact that what we do is to kind of um, try to figure out ways that people have lived very different lives than the ones that we're living right now. And so, in some ways, it's not necessarily like the past is going to give us the clues to live a better future.
Right, right.
But I do think sometimes there's a lot of things about life that can sometimes seem natural or seem inevitable. And that archaeology and anthropology more generally, those both tend to show us that um, yeah, that those things are not natural or inevitable or self-evident, that they're very kind of, they often have very short histories, they're often kind of very culturally or regionally specific. And in some ways that kind of doesn't necessarily show you an alternative to follow, but it does kind of open your world to other possibilities, I guess.
And to contingency. If you think of Freud, Levi Strauss, Evans Pritchard, Durkheim, they all fetishized the other because they thought the other had a way of living that transcended the smokestacks and the disputatious parliaments of modernity, right? That there was something there that could be traced in everything from marital rituals to passages through different points of life of other kinds that gave a clue to what made people human. The other thing I wanted to ask about related to that, because two of the places you work on are here, Mexico and Guatemala. And I wanted to ask you about that in a particular context. You've engaged a bit in your writing, and I should say here in the Global South, we don't have access to all the things you've written. For example, I don't have access to your waste book, which I really want to learn about today. So perhaps you could treat me in the same way as perhaps some of the listeners are, which is ignorant. But I have read some of your work in which you engage, at least en passant, the charge that archaeology is irredeemably colonial, part of a colonial project. I think that's absolutely untrue when it comes to Mexico, because here it seems to me that archaeology is immensely popular, treated very seriously, and is part of nation building and has been forever. So you're nodding. Does that mean that I haven't got it completely wrong?
Well, actually, it's funny. I don't know what you might have read, but I wouldn't say that archaeology is irredeemably part of a colonial project. Although there are archaeologists, and actually predominantly South American archaeologists, who have, not predominantly, but there are some very strong voices in South America who have said this, that it's impossible to separate archaeology from the kind of colonial enterprise that it's a part of. But I think that in some ways, what people mean when they say that is not so much about kind of where the interest in archaeology comes from, whether archaeology is kind of a connection to ethnicity or something like that in different parts of the world, which it very much can be. But I think what they mean by that is more to say that archaeology kind of comes out of, a certain kind of Enlightenment traditions of science. And so it's all built on thinking about nature and about time and about materials in really kind of Eurocentric Western ways of thinking. And one of the things that people have been trying to do recently in archaeology is to kind of think about how there might be other ways of, kind of understanding, experiencing, dividing the world, and that might actually lead us to different kinds of archaeology than just the one that we have kind of, kind of practiced mainly in European and American academia and kind of exported to other places. So it's not necessarily to say that like archaeology is a colonial undertaking. It's more kind of archaeology as practice coming out of a particular kind of historical tradition is a narrow view of the world that then gets kind of used to explain all of human history, which is probably limiting in some ways.
I was referring to an article you wrote in the Norwegian Archaeological Review, which is available at my local 7-Eleven, as you can imagine. And in which you allude to this critique of archaeology by others. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think in that, so that article is about kind of, there's a group of archaeologists who had kind of a very interesting project to try to do archaeology in the Maya area and to kind of shift the ways in which they're practicing the archaeology to kind of better align with what ancient Maya ideas of objects would have been. So when I'm trying to remember now because this article is I think from 2019. So this is my version of the article in my head. But that when they dig doing their field work, most of the time when we're digging as archaeologists, we have these little forms with us, and you find something and you mark off pottery, how many pieces, what color, and then another form for bone or stone or whatever. And I think they had a kind of recording system where instead of saying for example, shell, it was classified as kind of like windy, breathy, or airy material, because that's how the kinds of qualifiers in Maya hieroglyphic writing would describe a shell. And so it made categories that we wouldn't normally associate with one another. So I think jade was in the category with shell, for example, whereas, for most archaeologists, you separate shell from stone. Anyway, so it was an interesting kind of uh, exercise, and a kind of cool attempt to try to think about what one of these alternative archaeologies might look like. And so the article that I wrote was a response to their article that was commissioned by the journal. And that, I think one of the things that I kind of questioned was just sort of whether kind of, I mean, you mentioned Quine before we started talking, but before we started recording, but whether it's ever kind of possible to make that leap to say, let me think in another kind of cultural category that's not my own, or whether, what you actually end up doing is in some ways kind of just taking another language's terminology and force fitting it into your own categories, because that's how we think and work and experience the world. So that was the question.
Yes. Well, now that I've put you at a disadvantage by referring to an essay that I've read more recently than you have, which is probably true of several of your pieces, let me reverse that by asking you about a book that I've not read, but on one of, in inverted commas, my topics, namely Unmaking Waste, New Histories of Old Things. And I say one of my topics because one of the things I've been working on for over 20 years is electronic waste.
Oh, interesting.
And the earth pollutants and human pollutants of different media forms going back to the earliest days of printing.
Oh, interesting.
Well, it was interesting to me, but now I need this book. So since I don't have it, can you give me a crib, please?
Yes. So in some ways, I mean, I think the book kind of connects nicely to what we were just talking about, in that, so when I was in graduate school and writing my dissertation, I was working in particular on a kind of unusual archaeological deposit that's unusual, but not actually that uncommon. And so this is something that you see sometimes in the Maya area in Mesoamerica more broadly, but also there's other forms of this in other cultural contexts too. But basically, a kind of dense deposit of artifacts that in some ways look like trash. They're broken or they're burned, or you only have some parts and pieces of things. They're weathered or eroded, that kind of thing. But then they also don't quite look like trash because they're in unexpected places. So these were kind of distributed atop the floors of a Maya palace. Or they have materials that normally people don't throw away in, what we expect to find in trash context. So like materials like jade, or sometimes human remains, or things like that. So in the Maya area, I mean, people have found these at a number of archaeological sites since the 1930s, and in the 50s, some archaeologists kind of created a category for these that they actually just called them problematical deposits. And that has kind of, sometimes this happens, I think, in academia, that you create these kind of like placeholder categories, and then that becomes the terminology. And so now, I mean, and this was at first at the site of Piedras Negras in Guatemala, and then at the site of Tikal. And basically, like, they found hundreds of these contexts that they kind of labeled as problematical deposits, with the idea that later somebody would go through the problematical deposits and kind of figure out, are these burials, are these caches, are these some sort of like votive offering, but now it kind of, it just became a category that now sometimes people will say, you know, oh, and then we found a problematical deposit, as if that's like a thing that the Maya were doing, was like going around making problematical deposits, you know? And so when I was working on this, you know, quote unquote problematical deposit, I started thinking about kind of the assumptions that are wrapped up in this, that, you know, the problematical aspect is because it doesn't look like the kind of thing that we expect trash to look like, but it also doesn't look like the kind of thing that we expect a ritual deposit to look like. And so I was just kind of really interested in this question of how far back do we think our own idea of waste goes? You know, I mean, just sort of thinking, why is it that I think that I should be able to recognize Maya trash, ancient Maya trash? And so the book is kind of a long exploration of that question, of sort of thinking about, okay, well, how, where does kind of, where do contemporary ideas in kind of Europe and the United States come from, contemporary ideas of waste come from. And so part of the book is kind of tracing that history, and also to think about, you know, how the ways that we've interacted with waste and the ideas that we have about it have changed. So, you know, it's not that long ago that that waste kind of became, for example, like a public health problem. And before that, we didn't have, you know, the idea of sanitation, or the idea of kind of sanitary engineers as being responsible for the waste, or even the idea that like the city you live in should somehow be responsible for helping you manage your waste, you know, all of that, all of these things that, like I was saying kind of before, that seem kind of obvious or just kind of natural ways of being, are often kind of very shallow historically. And so then the book kind of looks at that trajectory in kind of North America and Europe, and then compares that to a very different history of waste in Latin America, by kind of moving back in time through the colonial period, especially in central Mexico, mostly because of the evidence available there, and then looking also at yeah, these archaeological deposits, to kind of argue that that basically I don't think that the kind of contemporary idea of waste as, you know, having an object, and then when the object breaks or somehow can't fulfill the use that it was intended for, but then it moves into this other category that you would call trash. And so there's lots of cool archaeological examples of people, you know, using and reusing broken pottery, you know, until the very, very, I mean, like there's some ethnographic examples where people who have thatch roofed homes, you know, they'll use a piece of pottery as a water jar, and then it breaks, and then they'll use the rim to kind of, you know, protect a seedling as it's growing. They'll use another piece as like a scoop for something, or a bowl to feed a pet or a chicken or something. And eventually, when there's nothing else you can do with it, they'll just throw it up on the roof because it'll protect the thatch and make it last longer. So it's like, it's, you know, and even up there, it's not trash. It's still doing something. It's still useful. It's still, yeah, not in the category of trash, I would say. So that's kind of the arc of the book, I guess, is to kind of trace out these ideas, to kind of make the argument that that I think we may be kind of yeah, assuming a lot about what is meaningful to people in the past, if we kind of assume that certain objects are useless trash and certain objects are not.
And I guess some of that has to do with contemporary capitalism too, the need with built-in obsolescence to define things quickly as obsolete and not reusable, and to diminish the capacity of people to repair them as well, let alone to repurpose them in the way you've just described.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's I mean, there's a bunch of kind of interesting examples of people, you know, especially kind of around like the late 19th, early 20th century, of people needing to be taught to waste, that, and part of this, like I said, there's all sorts of things that kind of dovetail around this, but it in like public water fountains, you used to have kind of a little steel cup that everybody used. And when they wanted people to shift to like disposable plastic cups, many people did not want to do this, or uh I mean, there's a kind of uh well-known example among kind of people that write about waste, where there's at an annual conference of the American Packaging Association, somebody gives this speech to say, this is in the early 60s, I think, or maybe the late 60s. Anyway, around this time. And yeah, he gives this speech where he says, the future of plastics is in the trash can. And everyone's kind of confused about what he means. And he says, right now we're producing packaging that we're doing this, in thousands of units or something. And if we can get people to take this material that lasts forever, like, is this kind of miracle material that we've invented. If we can get people to throw this away, then we'll be talking about producing billions of units. And that is obviously now what we do. I mean, that's what I mean about some of these things that we often kind of don't stop to think about. Like, of course, everyone kind of, I think, has heard, single-use plastics are bad, and we should, reduce and reuse and things like that. But you don't really stop to think about the fact that, we created this material that could last forever, that could take any shape, that can be airtight, can really keep things from rotting, or keep things sealed tightly, whatever. We've created this like amazing material, and we use it for 1 second and throw it away, which, yeah.
And it probably takes up 10% of the world's petroleum. So it's always already based on a non-renewable resource.
Yeah, exactly.
Incredible damage.
Yeah.
But actually it doesn't, because thanks to the current administration, we know that there's no problem with any of this.
Right. Right. You can see how I'm thinking about the future.
Right. Sorry, I've just brought us back to that unfortunate topic. Wow, it sounds like an amazing book. Really, really valuable work. And there are huge lessons to be learned from that repurposing story you told about the thatched roof home. But also, I guess it makes me think about Mexico City or Paris or Buenos Aires and those big boulevards. And people say, why are they there? They're there because of cholera, right? Usman initially, and then this rivalry between Mexico City and Buenos Aires to be, the Paris of the South, but in ways that have actually proven incredibly valuable, really important in the first couple of big waves of COVID-19, actually.
Mm-hmm.
The capacity to spend lots of time outdoors in a very safe way. I mean, I was living here in Mexico City at that time, and there was no lockdown of the kind that we had in many other places. Institutions were shut, but you could wander around wherever you wanted. And part of that was because there are these huge boulevards where, even in a city of 24 million, you can wander about and not be near anybody. So I think it is really interesting to think about some of the origins of these things and where public health meets everyday practice, and where also the public health origins of something can actually be shrouded in the proverbial mists. So
yeah, and actually, even going back further, when a lot of the early Spanish accounts from, kind of maybe 5-10 years after the fall of Tenochtitlan, a lot of those accounts kind of talk about how spotless the city is, that you can, one could walk around barefoot and not be worried about anything, that the Emperor Moctezuma had an army of 1,000 sweepers that would clean the city at night, that there was a system of latrines in place to reuse human waste for fertilizer. I mean, this is one of the chapters in the book also, is to say that there's to say that there's a different attitude toward waste in the pre-Columbian Americas before the arrival of the Europeans. And then with the arrival of Europeans, there are these moments where there are kind of clashes around kind of the different ideas that people have about what counts as waste, what you should do with it, what you shouldn't do with it. And in the book, I sort of talk about how this gets wrapped up with all sorts of things. It gets kind of tied up in religious conversion, right? That there are metaphors for kind of purity and filthiness that are important in Christianity and Catholicism. So that gets kind of, that spreads to also daily practice, where then the people who are responsible for dealing with waste are sort of the people who then become kind of marked as, both physically and morally like unclean. So yeah. Anyway, there's this I think also that this is, waste is kind of a sort of mundane topic, right? But once you kind of start looking into it, it's connected to all sorts of,
Oh my
big
God.
kind of social, political, economic
In the House
forces.
of Commons and the House of Lords in Britain, the astonishing consumption of cocaine is revealed thanks to waste, right? Analyses of agua negra. And I wouldn't be surprised if it were the same on K Street and on the Hill. This is
Yeah.
in Britain, it's the highest concentration of cocaine use in the country.
Wow.
Um,
Well, there have been some, garbage detectives who have, there's a couple of famous cases of people using garbage to, catch criminals, or there's kind of a famous super fan that used to go through Bob
Bob
Dylan's
Dylan's,
trash.
yeah. What was his name? W.J. Weatherby, is that the guy? I forget, but he was a super fan. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or maybe that's the name of a writer. But I was thinking
Yeah, I
about
think I
him.
forget his name, but I think it's something else. It's gonna work on it while we're.
Have you heard of
I
this
think
thing
it's
called the
AJ
internet?
Weberman.
Alan J. Weberman, yes,
There we go.
in Rolling Stone. I found this thing called the internet, Prof. Apparently, you can learn about how to treat measles, why it's not really a big problem, and all sorts of things like that. By the way, it's a huge outbreak here too.
Oh, really?
I was just at a hospital today, and every person working there was masked.
Mm,
It's a huge, huge problem.
that's
So,
great.
I wanted to ask you now about ourselves and other animals, because this is another project of yours. You've published a bit on this.
Mhm.
Very interesting, talking about the categories the Mayans used, where what appears to be a generic sort of proper name for a species can also actually be an individuated subject, and so on. Could you tell us a little bit about this work?
Yeah, so I think in all of my work, you can kind of get a sense. I'm sort of really interested in kind of the ideas that are kind of central to archaeology, the way that I have been trained to do it and practice it, and then to kind of think about how those ideas might look different from, in other times and places, basically. And so one of the things that's kind of a kind of area of specialization or area of my research is to look at the animal bones from archaeological sites, and especially from Maya archaeological sites. And so one of the things that I'm kind of generally interested in is not just kind of I mean, one of the things that we tend to do with animal bones from archaeological sites is to kind of, identify the different bones, which animals they come from, which parts of the animals, how they've been kind of cut up or butchered or burnt or cooked or whatever. And then to think about, okay, what are people eating? What can we kind of like reconstruct about the environment based on which animals we're finding in particular places? Um, are people trading or moving animals in different ways? So there's all kinds of interesting questions that you can do just from looking at what's there, kind of counting it up and doing that kind of thing. But I'm also just really interested in kind of how people in the past might have kind of related to or thought differently about animals. And so one of the things that that I've been interested in kind of recently is both thinking about whether, I mean, there was a lot of anthropological work especially in the 1960s, 1970s, to kind of look at whether people in different cultures had kind of the same structure when it came to looking at nature. So, in a in a kind of like Aristotelian way of like, do we all carve nature at the same joints kind of thing? Like if I look at a series of animals, am I going to recognize different species the same way that somebody, who speaks another language, comes from another culture, is going to recognize those animals? And so I'm really interested in that with respect to the ancient Maya. And a lot of that, I have a colleague named Franco Rossi who's at MIT. And we kind of write about these things a lot together. And Franco is an epigrapher, so he studies Maya hieroglyphic writing. And yeah, we sort of come together to think about these kinds of categories. And so one of the things that we had suggested in an article that we wrote together was that, for example, there are these small gray foxes that live in southern Mexico and Central America, and kind of looking at the images of those foxes painted on pottery, or sometimes in stone carvings, and then also the way that they're described in some text on the pottery and on the stones. We kind of suggested that for the Maya, those are actually kind of in the cat category rather than the dog category, which for, kind of in our standard biology taxonomies, we put foxes with canines. And yeah, that there's all sorts of ways in which you can imagine that, a small fox that climbs trees and, is much more similar to a cat than a dog in the kind of available categories of the time. So yeah, that's the kind of thing that I'm interested in, is sort of,
Yeah, really interesting.
yeah,
When I look at their faces, because I'm often in London where I used to live, and they're all through London now because
yeah.
of the way in which their local areas have been invaded and it's so difficult for them to eat. I see the face of a cat.
Yeah, and these gray foxes, I think, are actually a little bit smaller even than the foxes that are in, like, a little more gracile, and
Ah,
they're good tree climbers. So they're often kind of seen, yeah, kind of sitting in the little,
interesting.
in the crooks of trees. And if you think about, yeah, if you're in, Mexico or Guatemala, in the tropical areas, I mean, the cats there also climb trees, whereas the dogs certainly don't, and the dogs
Mm.
are, of the time, are more
Mm.
the kind of hairless dogs. So
Ah,
yeah, you
the
can
Xolo.
imagine.
I love them.
Exactly.
The
Yeah.
When I first started coming to Mexico, the middle class turned its collective nose up at Xolo. Xolo, by the way, folks, are these pretty much hairless native dogs here. And now they're quite fashionable, aren't they? Actually. Like you see dog walkers in ritzy parts of Mexico City with, 10 animals on a leash, on leashes. And there's going to be a Xolo there
Mm-hmm.
more often than not. Um, it's really
There's
interesting.
also, I've heard that there's been kind of like an interest in. yeah, for like middle class and upper middle class people in Mexico to use like you know, Nahuatl names and stuff like that.
One of the things that interested me when I moved here from Spain in March with this little guy, Chinguri, and we adopted a local cat from a feminist group at ITESO, which is a Jesuit university, folks, part of a system, who look after cats that live in the lecture halls and then look for homes for them. So I applied and was deemed to be, you know, acceptable. Anyway, so then I took them to the vet to register them and to get them vaccinated, so on. And I discovered two things that I didn't know. First of all, in Mexico, you're either a dog vet or a cat vet, but you don't do both, which was quite surprising.
Interesting.
The second thing was that I was asked what were their raíces, like their roots. And I didn't understand this at all. I mean, how would I know? They're from a street, one from Madrid, the other from Guadalajara, where I live. And then the lady vet explained this to me. So she said, "Where did you get them from?" I said, "Oh, well, I got him in Madrid and she's from here." Okay, so he is categorized as European officially, and she is categorized, Prof, as Mexican mixed.
Oh, wow.
Even though when you look at her, she is clearly of a particular breed. But, you know, this racial categorization of the Americas that goes back such a long way is really powerful. I mean, the Spanish had dozens of racial categorizations for the people they encountered and fought with here. I mean, really lots, didn't they? They
Yeah,
didn't,
yeah.
you know, native or anything like that.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and also, I mean, there's a historian named Rebecca Earl who's written a cool article about those casta paintings to show all the different kinds of like possibilities for, you know, mixing different types of people in 18th century Mexico. And one of the things that she suggests, which is an idea that I like that I teach sometimes to my students, is sort of like that, you know, these are kind of being made at a moment where people are also interested in these kinds of categories, just like more broadly in nature. And there's something very pleasurable about being able to kind of separate things into taxonomies, that there's something kind of very rewarding about kind of, you know, being able to look at the world around you and make more and more and kind of smaller and smaller kind of divisions and categories, and that's kind of part of the, yeah, part of the use of these paintings is to kind of, you know, look at these
Yeah.
things and think about the fact that you know a lot about the world around you by being able to kind of know all of these different possibilities and, you know, how they, yeah, all of the things that are associated with these different categories and things like that.
It's a big thing for the sciences and the social sciences, isn't it? I've got my categories.
Yeah.
Means I can proceed at a certain level.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, I mean, that's what I'm interested in kind of more broadly, is just sort of like the fact that people have that people have kind of divided the world in lots of different ways, you know? And especially, I mean, I'm always kind of thinking about this in terms of archaeology, but you know, I think, I mean, I wrote a paper, a couple of papers actually recently on these like mid 16th century codices from central Mexico that seem to show different categories of soil. So they're, you know, they're kind of records that are done to figure out who should be paying tribute from a certain town and how much they should be paying. And so the documents show agricultural fields, and then in the middle there are these glyphs that are more or less undecipherable because we don't have enough kind of comparative evidence to decipher the glyphs, but people have long assumed that they indicate soil quality. And I think one of the things that's like really kind of fascinating about that is this problem of how do we go about trying to figure out what it is people are telling us in those documents? You know, is it like, should we start from our own soil categories and say, okay, there are these many types of soil in the world, let's see which ones they are identifying and match them up? Or is it possible that people have a totally different system of classification and that if we could kind of, start from there, we might actually realize that there's room for new possibilities in our own classification system or something like that. I mean, I'm really, yeah, I'm really interested in this idea that people can kind of see and understand the world in really different ways.
Prof, I've got one more question for you, if I may. And once you've answered that, I'd also like to give you the opportunity to conclude matters by adding anything you might wish. And that could take the form of going over terrain we've already traversed, or it might be something entirely new. So my last question is to ask you about, I think perhaps more recent work that is about sensation, feeling, emotion, the sensorium, if you like. This is, I imagine, a tough one to research. So could you share with us some of your insights there and what you're doing?
Yeah, so I mean, so there is actually a kind of, I don't know what you'd call it, a subfield of archaeology that is interested in using archaeology to think about the senses in the past. And some of that, I mean, there's really interesting versions of this all over the world. Some of it involves kind of, thinking about, I mean, we often, if you visit an archaeological site today, it's mostly about the visual experience, right? We're mostly thinking about what the buildings might have looked like. And, a lot of things are reconstructed to kind of give a better sense of what the place would have looked like in the past. And so people have thought about, for example, well, what about sound, And actually, there's a Dutch researcher that recently did this for Teotihuacan, and kind of looked at all of the different types of instruments that had been found across the site, musical instruments, used those sounds, and then kind of, also experimented with kind of creating certain types of mood music. And so now when you visit the site, there's an app you can download that you can walk through the site, and the app kind of tracks you, and you can listen to different sounds that, some are instruments that would have been that, might have been played at Teotihuacan in the past, and some are, sounds of water and wind and things like that. But part of that is, yeah, that that I think as archaeologists, we're trying to kind of think about the fact that the just because we're working with kind of the things that remain from the past doesn't mean that that's necessarily that it has to kind of be a reduced vision of what the past of what the experience of the past would have been like. And so there's all sorts of ways to think about this, like with the remains of musical instruments is a good example. Imagery often helps, in terms of thinking about different types of sounds and things. But I've written with my PhD advisor, Steve Houston, some things on smell, for example, and how we might, think about, and some of that, is interest in waste and where waste would have gone. And so what things would have smelled like in the past, but also there's a lot of interest. I mean, there's a lot of kind of descriptions in Maya texts and depictions in Maya imagery of really beautiful smells. Sometimes you see people, holding bouquets of flowers, or, after eating a meal, smelling flowers or smoking tobacco. And, we sort of, try to think about, how you can kind of imagine these more expansive sensorial worlds, and not just think about archaeology as like a kind of, dry, dead thing.
And Prof, to conclude today, are there things you'd like to add? As I said, they could be entirely new, or they might be related to themes we've already addressed.
I mean, I think the last thing I would say, sorry, is that I mean so now I'm kind of getting started on a next book project, and one of the things that what I'm writing about at the moment is basically whether, I mean, I'm kind of pulling this interest in animals, but kind of I think a little bit closer to home to think about what might be possible in terms of using some of the methods that we have as archaeologists, which give us, you know, I think we have some really robust methods for kind of telling stories from the deep past that are well beyond texts or memories, and using those methods to look at the physical remains left by other species that are not humans. So, what would it mean to do an excavation of like a beaver dam and, figure out how long that beaver dam has been built in the same place, which are often over many, many generations. Could you do the same thing for termite mounds? I mean, actually, now you can do the same thing with birds' nests because birds have started incorporating plastic into their nests. So there was a paper recently about how birds in the center of Amsterdam had started using kind of trash in their nests, and when researchers excavated the nest, they found that all this plastic had expiration dates on it, and so they were able to kind of track the past 30 years of the birds' nesting behavior really precisely because they have these durable, datable materials. So I'm kind of interested in especially, as we're again like thinking about the future and thinking about how we're impacting the other lives on the planet besides the humans. And yeah, how we get more and more entangled with other species. I'm kind of interested in sort of whether we can use some of the methods we've used to study ourselves to study other types of animals.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Prof. I've really enjoyed reading your work, and even more have I enjoyed learning from you today.
Thank you. I've enjoyed this too.